Imagine the most uptight, rule-obsessed office suddenly flooded with puppies, chewing files, knocking over water bowls, and melting the hearts of everyone inside. What began as one man's frustration exploded into the most unforgettable showdown this neighborhood had ever seen. Neighbors laughed, the internet cheered, and the HOA found themselves powerless against a storm of cuteness. This isn't just a story about dogs. It's about fighting back with joy when rules go too far. Welcome to the wild tale of the puppy takeover. Jason Davis had lived in the same quiet suburban neighborhood for the past 10 years. He was a proud member of the community, a husband, father, and a man who valued peace and quiet. His house, nestled on the edge of the neighborhood, had a large backyard that was perfect for the things he loved, and one of those things was his pets. Jason had a soft spot for animals. His backyard was home to a kennel where he cared for a variety of dogs, his pride and joy. They weren't just any dogs, they were rescue animals, each with a unique story, each with a little bit of heartbreak in their past. Jason loved to rehabilitate them, give them a safe, loving environment and see them thrive. But as with everything in life, not everyone shared his enthusiasm. The Homeowners Association, HOA, which had always been known for its strict rules and regulations, had a problem with Jason's backyard setup. It wasn't that the dogs were noisy or disruptive. They were well behaved, always kept inside the fence. But the HOA had a rule: no commercial operations in residential spaces. They didn't care that Jason was not running a business. To them, the kennel was a violation of their rules. One afternoon, as Jason returned home from work, he noticed a large, official-looking letter taped to his front door. He opened it, carefully, already sensing what it would say. The HOA had sealed his pet kennel. No more dogs, no more animal rescue. Jason's blood boiled. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an attack on something that brought him peace and purpose. He tried to reason with them. After all, he wasn't running a business. He was simply a man who cared for animals. But the HOA was unrelenting. They cited the neighborhood's bylaws and told him he needed to remove the kennel within 2 weeks, or he'd face further penalties. Jason sat down in the living room, the letter in his hand, his mind racing. How could they do this to him? How could they target something so innocent, so pure? His dogs weren't just pets, they were his family, and yet the HOA saw them as nothing more than a violation of some arbitrary rule. He felt powerless, but there was a part of him, deep down, that refused to be defeated. As he looked out the window at the sealed-up kennel in his backyard, Jason's thoughts began to shift. He had been too passive, too compliant with the HOA's demands over the years. But this was different. They'd crossed a line. The idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. What if he could turn the tables? What if he could use their own rules against them? Jason wasn't just going to sit back and accept this injustice. No, he was going to fight back in a way they'd never expect. He grinned to himself, feeling a surge of excitement. If the HOA wanted to take away his kennel, he'd make sure they felt the full force of his anger and his creativity. And so the plan began to take shape. He wasn't going to tear down the kennel. No, he had something far more disruptive in mind. Jason spent the next few days mulling over his options. He knew the HOA wasn't the type to back down easily, and they had made their stance clear. They'd sealed his kennel, citing their ever-expanding rulebook, and demanded he remove it. But Jason wasn't the type to accept things without a fight, especially when it came to his dogs. He felt a fire ignite in him. He had been compliant for years, but this was personal. For the first time, Jason began to think strategically. He wasn't going to simply sit there and stew in frustration. He needed to make them feel something, make them understand just how deeply this affected him. He could have gone the route of legal action or trying to get public support, but he wanted something more direct, more impactful. The idea hit him while he was jogging through the neighborhood one morning. Jason had always used his morning runs to clear his head, but today his mind was full of plans and revenge. As he passed the HOA's small office, the thought came to him as though the universe had whispered it into his ear. The office was always so calm, so sterile. It looked as though nothing could disrupt the order there. But what if he brought chaos to them? Not just any chaos, though. something that no one could ignore. What if he could bring something they couldn't control, something universally adored and utterly unavoidable? He could bring the puppies. Jason stopped in his tracks, his eyes lighting up as the idea unfolded. He could take the very thing they'd tried to take from him, his pets, and turn it against them. The HOA's office was a tiny, confined space, and if he filled it with adorable, squirming puppies, the whole place would be overrun. It was genius, the perfect mix of disruption and innocence. But there was one hurdle. He would need a lot of puppies. Jason already had a few dogs at home, but to pull this off he needed more, much more. He quickly pulled out his phone and began making calls to local breeders and rescue centers. He wasn't asking for much, just a small army of puppies, enough to cause total chaos but still remain lovable enough for the HOA to be trapped by their own rules. As Jason reached out to his contacts, he could already picture the scene. The small sterile office filled with the squealing, wagging and running of puppies. The sight alone would be impossible to ignore. The sound of tiny paws on the tile floors would drive them crazy, and the cuteness would make it almost impossible for anyone to stay angry. The best part? He wasn't breaking any laws. These were just innocent puppies, not a commercial operation. By the end of the day, Jason had managed to secure 12 puppies. They were all around 8 weeks old, perfect for what he had in mind. A couple of beagles, a few golden retrievers, and even a couple of bulldogs, all of them adorable in their own right. They were small enough to be contained in pens, but full of energy and curiosity. Jason grinned to himself. He had the perfect plan, and soon enough the HOA was going to realize they'd made a mistake. He had decided he wasn't just going to sneak the puppies into the office. Oh no, he was going to make it official. He'd bring in enough puppies to create an impromptu petting zoo. Jason could already see it. He would set up little pens, bring in water bowls and add a few toys. It was going to be an irresistible spectacle. And the best part? It would be temporary. Jason had no intention of leaving the puppies in the office permanently, but if he could give the HOA a taste of their own medicine for a few hours, it would send a message they couldn't ignore. With the plan coming together, Jason's mind raced ahead. He had everything he needed: puppies, a location, and the element of surprise. He wasn't just getting back at them for sealing his kennel. He was sending a message. You can't just take what's mine without facing the consequences. Later that night, after arranging everything with the rescue centers, Jason took a moment to reflect on the idea. His heart raced with excitement, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Once he unleashed those puppies into the HOA office, there was no turning back. He smiled, feeling a sense of anticipation building up inside him. This was going to be good. Jason had always been the kind of guy who thought on his feet, and in that moment, he knew that the HOA was about to experience a level of chaos they'd never expected. He wasn't just fighting for his kennel anymore. He was fighting for his right to live in peace, for his love of animals, and for the joy they brought him. If the HOA couldn't see that, well, then he'd make them feel it. Jason woke up early the next morning, the excitement bubbling in his chest as he prepared for what was about to unfold. He had everything lined up: his 12 puppies, his plan and his resolve. Today was the day he would turn the tables on the HOA. They thought they could just lock up his kennel and force him to comply, but they had no idea what was coming. Jason's first stop was the local animal shelter, where he had arranged to pick up the puppies. Each one was more adorable than the last, their tiny faces filled with innocence and curiosity. He made sure to double-check each crate, ensuring the puppies were comfortable and ready for the big day. They would be the perfect distraction, their irresistible cuteness destined to create chaos in the HOA office. By the time Jason arrived at the HOA's office, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. The office building sat at the corner, tucked away behind a row of houses, looking as sterile and unwelcoming as always. But Jason wasn't intimidated. He had planned this moment down to the last detail. This was his time to make a statement, and he was going to make sure it was loud and clear. Jason parked his truck in the lot, loading up the first crate of puppies and carefully carrying them inside. The office was still empty, the usual cold silence hanging in the air. He set up the pens in the center of the room, placing blankets on the floor and scattering a few toys for the puppies to play with. He even set up a little banner that read, "Puppy petting pop-up today only." It was a playful jab at the HOA's rigid rules, a reminder that no one could control the joy these puppies brought. As Jason set up the last crate, he couldn't help but smile. It was impossible to look at these puppies without feeling a sense of warmth and joy. They were, in every sense, the antidote to the HOA's cold bureaucracy. And in just a few moments, the office would be alive with the sound of tiny paws and wagging tails. It didn't take long before the first employee arrived, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, no doubt ready to start her day of enforcing HOA rules. But as she stepped into the office, she froze. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. Puppies, everywhere, scurrying around, sniffing at each other, and tumbling over one another in a blur of fur and cuteness. Jason watched her reaction carefully, holding back a grin as she took in the scene. The woman looked around, clearly stunned, unsure of what to do. For a moment it seemed like she might just turn around and leave, but instead she stepped forward, eyes still wide with disbelief. What's going on here?" she stammered, her voice cracking slightly. Jason gave her a friendly nod. "Oh, you know, just a little pop-up event. Thought I'd bring some joy to the office today." The woman didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her mouth slightly agape, watching as a golden retriever puppy bounded toward her, tail wagging furiously. The little dog jumped up on her legs, and without thinking, she bent down to pet it. Jason could see the change in her expression immediately, the tension melting away as she scratched behind the puppy's ears. It wasn't long before a second employee arrived, and then another. The office slowly began to fill with people, all drawn in by the sound of barking and the sight of puppies playing in the middle of the room. Some of the employees seemed unsure at first, but before long they were all crouching down, cooing at the puppies and offering them treats. Jason couldn't help but laugh quietly to himself. It was working. He could see the chaos beginning to unfold. Employees were scrambling to keep up with the puppies' energy, trying to keep them from chewing on the office furniture and knocking over water bowls. A bulldog puppy had already managed to climb onto one of the desks, knocking over a stack of paperwork in the process. Meanwhile, a couple of beagles were wrestling in the corner, their tiny growls echoing in the otherwise quiet office. Jason couldn't have asked for a better result. The chaos was escalating, and with each new puppy that arrived, the office became more and more overwhelmed. The HOA staff, who prided themselves on their control and order, were now completely at the mercy of these tiny, adorable creatures. It was a beautiful thing, but Jason wasn't finished yet. He wasn't just going to stand back and watch. He had a mission, and he intended to complete it. As the puppies continued to scatter throughout the office, Jason moved towards the back, where the HOA's main meeting room was located. He knew this was where the real decision-makers were, where the board members would gather to discuss rules, regulations, and of course his kennel. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He could hear voices coming from inside. Probably some of the HOA board members, getting ready for their usual meeting. Jason smiled to himself. They had no idea what was about to hit them. He swung the door open, and immediately the room fell silent. Jason stepped inside, followed by a few of the puppies who had trailed him into the meeting room. The board members were sitting around the large conference table, but when they saw the puppies, their faces twisted in confusion, then frustration. "Jason," one of them snapped, rising from his seat. "What is the meaning of this?" Jason shrugged, pretending to be innocent. "Just thought you all could use a little distraction. You know, lighten up a bit." The board members exchanged nervous glances as the puppies began to explore the room, sniffing at the chairs and even climbing onto the table. One of the beagles took a leap, landing right in the middle of a stack of documents. Papers scattered everywhere, and the room erupted in a cacophony of barking, scrambling, and giggles. Jason stood back, watching with a sense of satisfaction. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The HOA was no longer in control. The dogs had taken over, and there was nothing they could do about it. The meeting room descended into absolute bedlam. Board members scrambled to gather their papers, while puppies darted under chairs, toppled water bottles, and barked with gleeful abandon. Jason stood near the back, his arms crossed, a calm observer of the pandemonium he had set in motion. For once, the HOA, notorious for its rigid control, was powerless. One of the board members, a stern man named Mr. Carpenter, attempted to restore order. His booming voice tried to cut through the commotion, but his words were drowned out by the shrill yips of the terrier as it clambered onto the conference table. Another member bent to retrieve a chewed-up binder, only to find a golden retriever, gnawing on the strap of her handbag. Each attempt to reinstate control dissolved further into absurdity. Jason couldn't help but revel in the irony. These were the people who had sealed his kennel, citing order and decorum, yet now they were knee-deep in fur, chaos, and slobber. The very idea of enforcing bylaws seemed laughable when the paperwork was being shredded by playful teeth. Meanwhile, word of the spectacle was spreading. A receptionist had snapped a photo of the puppies overrunning the office and sent it to a friend who shared it online. Within an hour, curious neighbors began trickling in. Parents brought their children, teenagers arrived with phones poised for recording, and suddenly the HOA office was hosting an impromptu community event. What Jason had planned as a disruption was blossoming into something bigger, a gathering that unified the neighborhood in laughter and shared delight. Children squealed with joy as they cuddled wriggling puppies. Adults chuckled nervously at the sight of the once intimidating board members trying and failing to maintain composure. The office, once a symbol of stiff authority, had been transformed into the liveliest spot in the subdivision. Jason stood near the doorway, watching the reactions. He noticed how some neighbors, usually aloof or divided by HOA squabbles, were smiling together, swapping stories about dogs they'd owned, and taking turns holding puppies. A sense of camaraderie filled the air, something the HOA had never managed to inspire. But beneath the laughter, Jason saw the board's mounting frustration. They were embarrassed. Their authority was slipping, not just in that moment, but in the perception of the entire neighborhood. A simple act of rebellion had exposed how fragile their control really was. Mr. Carpenter, red-faced and sweating, finally managed to push his way toward Jason. "This is unacceptable," he growled, his voice low but trembling with anger. "You've crossed a line." Jason met his glare with calm defiance. He didn't need to raise his voice. The scene spoke for him. The chaos, the community's joy, the board's humiliation. It was all proof that the HOA had overstepped by targeting him. Another board member tried a different approach. Mrs. Thompson, usually one of the more sympathetic voices, pleaded with Jason. "Please take them out. This isn't the place. We can talk about your kennel, but not like this." Jason considered her words, but he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. The office needed to feel the weight of its actions, to taste the very disruption they had imposed on him. For weeks, his yard had been silent, his kennel sealed, his dogs denied the freedom to play. Now the silence was broken, and loudly, the crowd grew thicker, and with it the board's humiliation deepened. Phones captured every moment. A bulldog knocking over a stack of HOA newsletters, a beagle stealing a pen straight from a director's hand, a child giggling uncontrollably as puppies swarmed her lap. These videos spread beyond the neighborhood, making their way onto local social media pages. Soon, comments poured in from outsiders mocking the HOA's inability to handle the situation. Jason could see the shift in power happening in real time. The board, once feared for their fines and warnings, looked small and inept against the force of community joy and a dozen puppies. Yet Jason knew this couldn't last forever. The novelty would wear off, and eventually the board would find its footing again. He needed to decide how to end the takeover in a way that cemented his point rather than weakening it. So he let it ride just long enough. Another 30 minutes passed, filled with barking, laughter, and board members, futile attempts at order. Then, with a sharp whistle, Jason called the puppies back. To everyone's surprise, they obeyed, scampering toward him as he guided them into their crates. Order returned slowly, but the memory of the chaos lingered in every corner of the office. Silence fell as Jason latched the final crate. The neighbors, still smiling and whispering among themselves, began to disperse. The board members stood in disarray, their clothes wrinkled, their papers scattered, their pride wounded. Jason turned, to face them one last time. "I think we're even now," he said calmly, his tone steady. He didn't shout, didn't gloat. He simply stated it as fact. Then, without another word, he lifted the first crate and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for him as he carried the puppies outside, loading them back into his truck. One by one, the crates were secured, and Jason climbed into the driver's seat. He took a final look at the office, still buzzing with the aftermath of his act. He knew he had shifted something important that day. As he drove away, Jason couldn't help but smile. The HOA might try to retaliate, but they would never erase the memory of their office overrun by puppies. And he knew his neighbors would remember too. For once they had seen the board not as powerful enforcers, but as fallible people scrambling against joy itself. Back at home, Jason unloaded the puppies, making sure they were comfortable and safe. His kennel might still be sealed, but his spirit was anything but broken. He felt empowered, energized, ready for whatever came next. The battle wasn't over, but he had won the first major victory. That night, as Jason scrolled through social media, he found videos of the takeover trending in the local community groups. Comments ranged from amusement to outrage, but overwhelmingly people were on his side. They praised his creativity, his courage, and his love for animals. Even those who didn't know him personally were cheering him on. Jason leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The HOA had wanted to silence him, but instead they had given him a platform, and he wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning of a larger fight, one he was now determined to win. The days following the puppy takeover were unlike anything Jason had ever experienced in the neighborhood. The HOA office incident had spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the community had seen the videos. Parents laughed about their children holding puppies in the middle of a board meeting. Teenagers replayed clips of beagles dragging files across the floor. Even residents who had once kept their distance from Jason stopped him during walks to offer smiles, pats on the back, or whispered words of support. Jason noticed the shift immediately. For years, the HOA had been the looming authority, dictating paint colors, mailbox styles, lawn heights, and backyard structures. Now, people were laughing at them, and Jason was the unlikely hero who had exposed their rigidity with something as harmless as puppies. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other were suddenly bonding over the story, and Jason felt a sense of pride. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had reminded everyone of the joy that rules so often stripped away. But with praise came pushback. Within days, the HOA released a statement through email and flyers, calling Jason's stunt reckless and a disruption of administrative operations. They threatened fines and even hinted at legal action, citing trespassing and unauthorized use of HOA property. The stern wording made it clear they were embarrassed and determined to reassert control. Jason read the statement at his kitchen table, shaking his head. He wasn't surprised. He knew they couldn't let it slide. Still, their threats didn't scare him. The community was watching now, and the HOA had lost much of its intimidation. If they tried to punish him too harshly, they risked alienating the very residents they claimed to represent. That evening, Jason sat on his porch, sipping coffee while his dogs played in the yard. His phone buzzed with notifications. Neighbors, tagging him in posts, local groups debating the incident, and even a small-town news outlet requesting an interview. The story had grown larger than he expected. It wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a conversation about power, community, and the absurd lengths HOAs sometimes went to enforce control. Despite the praise, Jason knew the fight wasn't over. The board wouldn't forget what he'd done, and they would come after him in ways less public, more calculated. He needed to prepare for whatever was coming. The following week, the HOA scheduled a special meeting to address the incident. Flyers were taped to every mailbox, urging residents to attend. Jason immediately knew what it was about. He expected a grilling, maybe even an attempt to humiliate him in front of the neighborhood. But he wasn't afraid. In fact, he welcomed it. For once, the community would see the board's tactics out in the open. The night of the meeting, the community center filled with more people than Jason had ever seen at an HOA event. Usually these gatherings drew a handful of residents, mostly retirees or the occasional frustrated homeowner. But now the room buzzed with anticipation, every seat taken, people leaning against walls just to watch. Jason walked in, head high, feeling dozens of eyes follow him. Some neighbors smiled warmly, others offered small nods of encouragement. The board sat at the front, stiff and grim. Mr. Carpenter's face was still pink with indignation, his lips pressed tightly together. Mrs. Thompson looked weary, as if she dreaded what was about to happen. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but everyone knew why they were there. Soon enough, Carpenter launched into his tirade. He described Jason's actions as irresponsible, claiming the puppies posed a health hazard, that residents without consent had been exposed to animals. In an office environment, that property had been damaged. His words dripped with outrage, but as Jason scanned the room, he noticed the residents weren't reacting the way Carpenter wanted. Some rolled their eyes, others whispered to their neighbors, stifling laughter at the exaggerated accusations. Then came the turning point. A young mother stood up from the crowd, her voice clear and steady. She spoke about how her daughter hadn't stopped talking about the puppies, how it was the first time she'd felt excited about anything related to the HOA. She said Jason's act reminded her why she loved the community in the first place. Applause followed, breaking the board's carefully staged control. One by one, more residents spoke up. A retiree admitted he had laughed harder than he had in years. A teenager shared the viral video, playing it on his phone for the entire room to hear the chorus of barks and laughter. Each story chipped away at the board's authority, each voice reminding them that rules weren't supposed to suffocate joy. Jason stayed quiet through it all, letting his neighbors speak for him. For once, he didn't need to fight alone. The community had taken up his cause, their voices louder than any defense he could mount. By the end of the meeting, the board was visibly shaken. They tried to reassert control, promising disciplinary measures, but the crowd wasn't buying it. The residents left buzzing, energized, almost defiant. The balance of power had shifted, and Jason knew the board could feel it too. Back. At home, Jason leaned against his porch railing, watching the stars. His phone buzzed again with messages of support, neighbors thanking him, strangers online calling him clever. But Jason knew it wasn't over. The HOA might have lost ground tonight, but they wouldn't give up easily. They thrived on control, and he had just torn a hole in their facade. Still, Jason felt stronger than ever. He wasn't just a man with a kennel anymore. He had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most rigid systems could be shaken by something as small and as powerful as a puppy. The board would strike back. Jason was sure of it. But when they did, he would be ready. Jason knew the board would not let the humiliation fade quietly. For weeks, they had been mocked in neighborhood conversations, lampooned on social media, and laughed at by the very residents they once intimidated. Pride fueled their persistence. They began sending Jason letters again. Formal notices warning of fines, veiled threats of legal action, and reminders that his kennel remained sealed. Each envelope was stamped with authority, but each one landed on Jason's kitchen counter with less weight than the last. The people had spoken, and Jason no longer stood alone. The neighborhood had changed. Families who once avoided HOA meetings now attended in numbers, not to listen meekly but to question, to challenge and to resist. The memory of the puppies overrunning the office remained vivid, a symbol of joy triumphing over rigidity. Children still pointed at Jason during walks, whispering about the puppy guy. Teenagers waved, some asking if he planned another stunt. Jason laughed it off, but deep down he knew the movement had grown beyond him. The board, desperate to reclaim control, called for another official meeting, this time with stricter rules. No pets allowed, no cameras, no interruptions. They wanted the seriousness restored. Jason attended, not because he believed in their authority, but because he wanted to see how far they would go. The room was tense. Board members sat like statues, their faces carefully neutral. Mr. Carpenter cleared his throat, launching into, a monologue about maintaining standards and ensuring order. He referenced Jason directly, calling his actions childish and damaging to the community's reputation. The words hung in the air like stale smoke. Then came the rebuttal, not from Jason, but from the residents. One after another, voices rose in challenge. A father spoke about how the HOA fined him for leaving a basketball hoop outside. A grandmother recalled being reprimanded for planting flowers not on the approved list. A young couple revealed the endless struggle they faced just to install solar panels. Each story peeled back another layer of resentment, exposing the discontent that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Jason realized something important in that moment. The puppies had not just embarrassed the HOA, they had opened a door. People who once felt powerless were now speaking up, emboldened by laughter and unity. The board faltered. Mrs. Thompson tried to soften the tension, suggesting a compromise about Jason's kennel. Carpenter resisted, his voice rising, but the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd silenced him. Authority, once unquestioned, was slipping through their fingers. Finally, after hours of argument, a vote was proposed. Should Jason's kennel remain sealed, or should the restriction be lifted under revised guidelines? The room buzzed with whispers as ballots were distributed. Jason sat quietly, heart steady. He had not begged for this moment. It had come naturally, drawn by community momentum. When the results were read aloud, a cheer erupted. The kennel would be reopened under simple conditions that Jason already met. No commercial use, reasonable noise control, proper cleanliness. It was common sense, rules Jason had always followed. For him, it was not just a victory, it was vindication. Jason walked home that night beneath a canopy of stars, his steps light. His dogs barked in greeting as he opened the gate, tails wagging as though they already knew. He stood by the kennel, sealed no longer, and felt the weight of the struggle lift from his shoulders. The battle had been about more than dogs. It had been about dignity, about pushing back against authority that had forgotten its purpose. The HOA existed to serve the community, not to dominate it. And now, thanks to a dozen puppies, everyone had been reminded of that truth. Jason leaned against the fence, watching his dogs play in the yard. He thought about the chaos in the office, the laughter of children, the way neighbors had rallied, together. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, but that's what he had become. Not through anger, but through joy. Not through confrontation, but through creativity. The HOA would still exist. Rules would still be written. But they would think twice now before acting with arrogance. And if they forgot again, Jason knew the community wouldn't. As the night deepened, Jason whispered to himself, a quiet vow. Never again would he let them silence what mattered most. His kennel was open, his dogs were free, and his spirit was unbroken. The story of the puppy takeover would live on, retold at neighborhood barbecues, laughed about in online groups, remembered whenever someone felt the heavy hand of unfair rules. It was more than a prank. It was proof that even the smallest, softest things, paws, wagging tails, playful barks, could topple walls of authority. And so Jason's fight ended not in bitterness, but in triumph. His dogs played under the moonlight, their joy echoing through the neighborhood. Somewhere deep inside, Jason knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had learned a lesson they would not soon forget. You can lock a kennel, but you cannot cage your spirit. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.